The dust was a living thing, a fine red ghost that coated every surface of Jedediah's life. It settled on the rim of the empty water glass by the sink, on the faded photograph of his wife, Martha, her smile a pale memory on the mantelpiece, and it settled deep in the lines of his own face, canyons carved by sun and sorrow. The silence in his small ranch house was a presence as solid as the rough-hewn table. It was a silence he had cultivated, a penance he paid daily for the crime of surviving when Martha and their little Anna had not. Each morning he rose with the sun, the routine a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull him under. He mended fences that didn't need mending, checked on cattle that needed no checking, and worked until his body ached with a fatigue that could almost, but never quite, eclipse the ache in his soul. He was a man hollowed out, a walking echo in the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. It was during one of these self-imposed labors, replacing a solid post near the dry creek bed, that he heard it. A sound that did not belong. Not the call of a hawk or the rustle of a snake in the brush, but a snap. A twig. Human. His hand went instantly to the rifle propped against the fence line. He moved with a quiet economy, a predator's grace that belied the emptiness within. He crested the small rise, his eyes scanning the parched landscape. And then he saw them. 3 figures, small and ragged, huddled in the meager shade of a dying cottonwood. They were children, though the term felt wrong. They were more like feral pups, all sharp angles and wary eyes, poised for flight. The oldest, a girl of maybe 12 with hair the color of straw and a fierce, protective stance, held a heavy rock in her hand. Beside her, a smaller girl with wide, dark eyes clutched the tattered sleeve of an even smaller one, a child who seemed less a person and more a bundle of rags, her face hidden against her sister's leg. They were starving. He could see it in the hollows of their cheeks, the skeletal frame beneath the grime-caked clothes. They saw him at the same time. The oldest girl's knuckles went white around the rock. Her chin lifted in defiance. Jedediah said nothing. He simply stood there, his rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed at the unforgiving earth. He was a mountain of a man, and he knew the fear he inspired. He'd seen it in the eyes of wild horses before they broke. The oldest girl took a half-step forward, shielding the other 2 with her body. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, cracking with thirst and a desperation that was ancient. "We won't take much," she said, the words a stark plea wrapped in pride. "Just water. Then we'll be gone." Jedediah's gaze drifted from the fierce protector to the youngest, the one who still hadn't moved. The small child slowly lifted her head, and for the first time, he saw her face. Her eyes. They were vast and empty, 2 polished stones at the bottom of a dried-up well. There was no fear in them. No defiance. There was nothing. It was an emptiness he knew intimately. He saw his own reflection in that void, the same desolate landscape that stretched out behind him, within him. It was a recognition that struck him deeper than any bullet could have. Hope was a currency, and this child was bankrupt. He felt the foundations of his careful, miserable solitude tremble. The grief he had caged so tightly in his chest rattled its bars. He lowered the rifle completely, resting its stock in the dust. He didn't speak, for words were clumsy, useless things. Instead, he gave a short, sharp nod toward the path that led back to his house. Back to the well with its cold, clean water. Back to the pantry with its tins of beans and sacks of flour. Back to the silence that was about to be broken. The oldest girl watched him, her suspicion a palpable force. She looked from his weathered face to the house on the horizon, then back to her sister's. A silent, desperate calculation was taking place. He turned and began to walk, not looking back, the simple act an invitation and a risk. He heard the faint scuff of worn leather on dirt behind him. A hesitant step. Then another. He did not know if he was saving them or damning himself, bringing 3 new ghosts into a house already crowded with them. He just knew that for the first time in 3 years, the dust on the path seemed less like a shroud and more like a road leading somewhere other than yesterday. The girls moved through his house like wary spirits, their bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. They drank the water he offered in frantic, gulping swallows, their eyes darting around the room, cataloguing every shadow, every exit. He set 3 plates of beans and cornbread on the table, then retreated to the porch, giving them the space he sensed they needed. Through the open door, he watched them eat. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against tin and the hurried, anxious rhythm of their chewing. They ate as if the food might be snatched away at any moment, as if nourishment itself were a fleeting privilege. When they were finished, the oldest, Ilara, meticulously gathered the plates and brought them to the wash basin, her movements precise and automatic, the learned behavior of someone long accustomed to servitude. He had offered them Anna's old room, with its small, sturdy bed and a window that looked out onto the endless sea of grass. They had looked at the bed, at the clean quilt Martha had stitched, and then, without a word, had gathered a spare horse blanket from a chair and huddled together in the far corner of the main room, a small, tight knot of shared fear. Jedediah's heart, a dull and useless organ for so long, felt a strange, painful twinge. He didn't push. He understood the language of cages. A door left open can be more terrifying than a lock. The next day, he resumed his routine, but it was different now. The silence was punctuated by their presence. He could feel their eyes on him as he split wood, as he mended a harness. They were observing him, judging his every move, searching for the telltale signs of the monster they clearly expected him to be. That afternoon, while clearing out a small trunk of Anna's things he hadn't had the strength to touch, his hand closed around a small, wooden horse, its paint worn smooth by a child's loving grip. He ran his thumb over its back, the memory a sharp, sudden pain. Later, when the house was quiet and the girls were asleep in their corner, he crept in and placed the small horse on the edge of their blanket, near the youngest one's hand. The next morning, he saw her, Seren, clutching the toy to her chest, her small fingers wrapped tightly around its wooden legs. It was the first possession he had seen any of them claim. It was a start. A few days later, Ilara found him by the corral, watching him gentle a new colt. She stood at a distance, her arms crossed, her posture still defensive. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice flat. There was no need to ask who she was. The question hung in the air between them, blunt and heavy. Jedediah didn't turn from the horse. He kept his voice low and steady, a tone meant to soothe skittish things. "Fever," he said. "Took her in 2 nights." He paused, his hand stroking the colt's trembling neck. "Took her mother a week later." He didn't offer details. He didn't dress the truth in sentiment. He just gave it to her, a piece of his brokenness offered in exchange for her own. He felt her gaze on his back, less an accusation and more an assessment. He had passed some unspoken test. The middle girl, Lyra, the one with the observant, quiet eyes, started to follow him. She never spoke, but she watched. She watched him pull weeds from Martha's neglected garden, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle with the fragile stems of the wild herbs that still grew there. She saw the way he'd pause and stare at the horizon, his face a mask of such profound loneliness that it made her own chest ache. She was beginning to learn that sadness came in different shapes. Theirs was the sharp, panic pain of a fresh wound. His was a dull, constant ache, a phantom limb that would never heal. The fragile truce they had built was threatened a week later by the arrival of the town sheriff. Sheriff Brody was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, all bluster and bureaucratic certainty. He rode up, his horse kicking up a cloud of official dust. "Jedediah," he called out, not dismounting. "Heard tell you had some strays wander onto your land." The girls, who had been sitting on the porch steps, vanished into the house like smoke. Jedediah wiped his hands on his trousers and faced the lawman. "They're not strays," he said, his voice low and even. "And this is my land," Brody grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Folks are talking." 3 girls, looking rough. "There are places for children like that." "Institutions, they're fine here," Jedediah stated. It wasn't a request. It was a fact. Brody chewed on this for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the silent house. "Just see you keep things proper, Jed. The law has a long reach." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a new, cold dread in the air. The peace was an illusion. The world had taken note of their small sanctuary, and the world had a way of destroying such things. That night, Jedediah looked out the window and saw a lone rider silhouetted against the blood-red sunset, far in the distance, a dark speck on the edge of his world. It was too far to be Brody. It was someone else. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were coming. The rhythm of the ranch slowly, imperceptibly, changed. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the oppressive, echoing silence of grief. It was softer now, filled with the spaces between small, emerging sounds. The whisper of the girls' voices as they spoke to each other, a sound as shy and delicate as a moth's wing. The soft thud of the wooden horse dropping onto the floorboards. The scrape of a small hand helping to shell peas into a metal bowl. It was the sound of life tentatively reseeding itself in barren ground. Lyra became his shadow in the garden. He showed her how to tell the difference between a weed and a shoot, how the sun could be a friend or a foe to a young plant. He spoke to her of soil and water, of patience and growth, and in talking about the earth, he found he was talking about them. She absorbed it all with a silent intensity, her small hands mimicking his own, patting the soil around a tomato plant with a care that was heartbreaking to witness. One evening, as he was lighting the lamp, a small voice cut through the growing dusk. Jed, he froze. He turned to see Seren, the youngest, the girl with the hollow eyes, looking directly at him. The wooden horse was clutched in her hand. It was the first word she had spoken to him. His name. A simple sound, a single syllable, but it landed in his chest with the force of a physical blow. It was acknowledgement. It was existence. He could only nod, his throat too tight to form a reply. A fragile trust was being woven, thread by painful thread. Ilara, the fierce guardian, remained the most aloof, but even her armor was beginning to show chinks. He had ridden into town for supplies, a journey he now made with a purpose beyond his own sustenance. He returned not only with flour and salt, but with 3 small spools of ribbon, 1 blue, 1 yellow, 1 red. He left them on the table without a word. That evening, he saw the flash of blue in Lyra's hair, and a tiny strip of red tied carefully around the wooden horse's neck. Later, sitting on the porch as twilight bled across the sky, Ilara came and stood near the railing. A faint yellow ribbon was braided into her straw-colored hair. She didn't look at him, but she spoke to the horizon. He used to bring ribbons, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Right before he sold someone the fragile piece in Jedediah's heart shattered. He didn't have to ask who he was. The lone rider he'd seen on the horizon now had a face in his mind, a face of casual cruelty. They're just ribbons, Ilara, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Sometimes a thing is just what it is. She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his for the lie. She didn't find one. For the first time, he saw not just a protector, but a child who had been forced to carry a burden far too heavy for her years. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just offering them food and shelter, he was in a battle for their very souls against the ghosts of their past. The ghosts became flesh the next afternoon. He was coming in from the barn when he saw the girls frozen on the porch, their bodies rigid, their faces pale masks of pure terror. Following their gaze, he saw him. A man, dressed in a waistcoat and dusty city boots, stood by the corral gate as if he owned it. He was lean and smiling, but the smile didn't reach his cold, reptilian eyes. He held a silver-tipped cane, tapping it idly against his boot. The man's gaze slid past the girls and landed on Jedediah, a look of smug appraisal. "Quite the little homestead you have here," the man said, his voice a silky, condescending drawl. He took a step forward, and the girls flinched back as one. "I do apologize for my wards. They have a tendency to wander. I am Marcus Thorne. I've come to collect what's mine." The word mine hung in the air, a vile, possessive thing. He looked at the girls not as children, but as livestock that had slipped their pen. Jedediah felt a cold, clean rage rise within him, a feeling so pure and powerful it burned away the last vestiges of his lethargy. He moved without thinking, his body placing itself directly between Thorne and the porch, a human wall. He was taller than Thorne, broader. He let the man feel his size, his presence. "They ain't wards," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl that came from the deepest part of him. "And they ain't yours." Thorn's smile tightened, the mirth vanishing from his eyes, leaving only a chilling cruelty. "That's where you're mistaken, farmer. They are my property. And I always get my property back." The sun beat down on the three of them, a silent, tense tableau. The fragile piece had not just been broken, it had been incinerated. The battle was no longer against ghosts. The monster was real, and he was standing in Jedediah's yard. Marcus Thorn did not press the confrontation. He was not a man who dirtied his own hands when the system could do it for him. He gave Jedediah a final, contemptuous look, a predator promising a return, and then departed as smoothly as he had arrived. His leaving, however, offered no relief. It was a reprieve, not a victory, and the air he left behind was thick with poison. The girls retreated back into their shells, the progress of weeks undone in a single moment. Seren no longer spoke, Ilara's face was a stony mask, and Lyra's eyes were once again filled with the old, hunted fear. Jedediah knew he couldn't just wait for the storm to break over them. He had to ride into it. The next morning, he left the girls with a day's worth of food and water, his rifle loaded and propped by the door, and made the long ride into town. He found Sheriff Brody in his office, a cramped space that smelled of stale coffee and ink. Brody leaned back in his chair, the picture of bored authority, as Jedediah stood before his desk. "I need your help," Jedediah said, foregoing any pleasantries. "A man named Marcus Thorn." His come for the girls' Brody's expression didn't change. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the desk. This Marcus Thorn. It was a legal document. A writ of guardianship, stamped and sealed, granting Marcus Thorn full custody of Ilara, Lyra, and Seren Vance. The paper felt heavy and foul in Jedediah's hand. "This is just paper," Jedediah said, his voice tight. "This man is poison." "You should have seen them when he showed up," Brody sighed, a long, weary sound of utter indifference. "Look, Jedediah. I don't know what story those girls spun for you, and frankly, I don't care. What I have here is the law. Black and white. It says they belong to him. My job is to enforce that. It's simple if it ain't simple," Jedediah shot back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "It's wrong, right, and wrong don't have much to do with it," Brody said, taking the paper back. "The law is the law. Thorn will be back tomorrow to collect them, and I'll be with him to make sure it goes smoothly. I suggest you don't make it difficult." Jedediah stared at the man, at the bland, bureaucratic face of a society that would rather serve a piece of paper than protect a child. He saw the utter futility of his appeal. He had come seeking justice and found only rules. He rode home under a bruised purple sky, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. When he walked into the house, 3 pairs of eyes were on him, waiting for a verdict. He didn't have to say a word. They saw it on his face. Ilara, her voice trembling for the first time, asked the question that twisted a knife in his gut. "You going to sell us back to him?" The words were an echo of her earlier suspicion about the ribbons, a testament to a lifetime of broken promises and betrayals. Jedediah knelt, so he was on their level, so they could see the truth in his eyes. He looked at each of them, at Ilara's fierce and frightened face, at Lyra's silent tears, at Seren's hollow gaze. "Never," he said. The word was a vow, a sacred oath. He was no longer just a man grieving his past. He was a guardian. He was a father. That night, he did not sleep. He checked the action on his rifle. He boarded up the back window. He was preparing not for a legal handover, but for a siege. He was a solitary man against the world, against the law, against a man who saw children as chattel. But he was not alone. In the pale moonlight filtering through the front window, he saw 3 small shadows creep out of their corner and sit by the hearth, watching him. They weren't hiding anymore. They were keeping watch with him. The next day dawned grey and oppressive, the air heavy with unspoken violence. The sound of hoofbeats came just after noon. 2 riders. Sheriff Brody and Marcus Thorn. Thorn dismounted with a smug flourish, while Brody remained on his horse, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Jedediah!" Brody called out. "It's over. Send them out." The front door opened. Jedediah stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. The girls were not behind him. He had told them to hide, to stay in the root cellar no matter what they heard. "They're not coming out," Jedediah said, his voice calm. Thorn laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Always the hard way," he nodded to Brody. "Sheriff, do your duty." Brody hesitated, his gaze fixed on Jedediah. "Don't do this, Jed." Suddenly, a rock flew from the side of the house, striking Thorn's horse hard on the flank. The animal shrieked and reared, throwing Thorn to the ground. Lyra stood by the corner of the porch, another rock in her hand, her face a mixture of terror and defiance. She was no longer just a victim. She was a fighter. Thorn scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "You little witch," he screamed, drawing a small, silver derringer from his coat. He leveled it at Lyra. Jedediah didn't think. He fired. Not at Thorn, but at the ground just in front of his feet. The blast echoed across the plains, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. Thorn stumbled back, his shot going wild into the air. The moment of hesitation was all Jedediah needed. He lunged off the porch, a silent, furious force, and slammed into Thorn, driving him to the ground. The fight was not a drawn-out battle, it was a desperate, brutal explosion of rage and protective instinct. The crack of bone, the grunts of pain, the frantic scrabbling in the dust. Jedediah was a man possessed, fueled by a righteous fury he hadn't felt in years. He was fighting for the family he had lost and the one he was refusing to lose now. He gained the upper hand, his fist raised over Thorn's blooded, sputtering face. And then he stopped. He looked up and saw Lyra and Seren now standing with Lyra, huddled together, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. Sheriff Brody had his gun drawn, aimed squarely at Jedediah's chest. The world fell silent, broken only by Thorn's pained gasps and the heavy, ragged sound of Jedediah's own breathing. Brody's face was a stone, his eyes unreadable, the law and his conscience at war within him. His finger was tight on the trigger, the decision of what to do next hanging in the balance, a single heartbeat away from sealing all their fates. The silence stretched, taut and fragile as a spider's thread. Sheriff Brody stood frozen, his pistol leveled, his gaze flickering from the man on the ground to the man kneeling over him, and finally, to the three small girls huddled by the porch. He saw Marcus Thorn, a man armed with the full authority of a legal document, his face a mask of spitting rage and humiliation. He saw Jedediah, a good man pushed past his breaking point, his knuckles bloody, his chest heaving, a fierce protector who had just declared war on the law itself. But it was the girls who held Brody's gaze. He saw the raw terror in their eyes, but beneath it, something new. A defiant solidarity. They were not looking at Jedediah with fear of him, but with fear for him. In that moment, they were not three orphans and a rancher. They were a single, unified entity, a fortress with its walls breached, but its banner still flying. Brody had spent his life enforcing the lines drawn on maps and papers, the neat, orderly rules that were supposed to hold the world together. But here, in the dust and the blood, those lines blurred into meaninglessness. He saw the cold letter of the law in Thorn's sneer, and he saw the living, breathing spirit of justice in the way Jedediah had thrown himself in front of that small, silver gun. His hand, which had been so steady, trembled slightly. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his pistol. He then walked over to the gasping Marcus Thorn and hauled him to his feet. "Marcus Thorn," Brody said, his voice flat and official. "You're under arrest." Thorn stared at him, incredulous. "What? For what?" "He assaulted me." "The law is on my side." "For disturbing the peace," Brody said, pulling Thorn's hands behind his back with a rough jerk. "For brandishing a firearm in a threatening manner. For being a public menace. I'm sure I can think of a few more charges on the ride back to town." He didn't look at Jedediah. He couldn't. He had bent the law until it broke, and he didn't want to see the gratitude in the other man's eyes. It was a private, personal atonement for a career of indifference. He shoved Thorn towards his horse, a man defeated not by fists, but by a sudden, unexpected act of conscience. The aftermath was quiet. The dust settled. Jedediah rose slowly, his body aching. He turned to the girls. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They simply watched him, their small faces smudged with dirt and tears. He walked past them into the house and slumped into a chair at the table, the adrenaline leaving him weak and shaky. A moment later, Ilara appeared at his side with a wet cloth. She began to gently, hesitantly, clean the blood from his knuckles. Lyra brought him a cup of water, her hand trembling so much that some of it sloshed over the side. Even Seren came near, placing the small wooden horse on the table beside his hand, a silent offering of comfort. They were caring for him. The dynamic had shifted forever. They were no longer just refugees he was sheltering, they were a family, tending to their own. Weeks turned into a quiet, healing month. The ranch found a new rhythm, one of shared chores and easy silence. Jedediah taught Ilara how to sight a rifle, not for violence, but for security. He taught Lyra how to read the clouds, to predict the rain. And he learned to listen to Seren's silences, which were now filled with a quiet contentment rather than a hollow emptiness. One evening, he sat at the table, carving 2 more small figures from scraps of pine. They were rough, simple shapes, but they were unmistakably girls. He finished them and walked to the mantelpiece. He placed the 2 new figures next to the worn wooden horse, forming a small, silent family. Then he moved them to stand beside the faded photograph of Martha and Anna. He wasn't replacing his past. He was allowing it to make room for a future. The old grief and the new hope could stand together. They could